So, 385th Bomb Group, heavy is what it stood for. But let's go back over 100 years. Elmswell, Great Ashfield was an aerodrome in World War I. And Peter McGee has written this excellent book, Forgotten Sentinel, about Elmswell. It was part of the anti-Zeppelin defences in World War I. I recommend the book. The airfield was resurrected in World War II, which is our story. Briefly, these are all the American bases in East Anglia in World War II, not including the RAF bases that were dotted around there. Two air forces, the 8th and 9th Air Force. Strategic was the 8th, tactical was the 9th. The 385th were part of the 8th Air Force. Now, the aerodrome was Elmswell in World War I, but in World War II it became Great Ashfield because they had an RAF Hemswell. And for RT radio communication, you did not want anything that could be confused. So it became predominantly known in World War II as Great Ashfield. And that's pretty much my project moving on. 1942, they built over the World War I airfield, John Lang and Company, and it was an A-class aerodrome by the shape of the letter, the standard aerodrome of the day. For Great Ashfield, they uprooted 3,000 trees, 8 miles of hedgerow, 250,000 cubic yards were excavated, 108 cubic yards of concrete then came in to create the aerodrome, and 250,000 tonnes of aggregate. Much of that coming from the blitzed cities, London, Birmingham, wherever it might be. And so it disappeared under the concrete on Great Ashfield and emerged many, many years later when the concrete was broken up and moved on again under the M25. So it's travelling concrete. I was also told by somebody involved in the aerodrome construction that they had a weighbridge near the entrance, and the Lang and Company lorries would drive in, they'd go on the weighbridge to get the aggregate accounted for and paid for, and then the lorry would go round the base, off the base, dirty number plates, come back round and go in again, and get a double count. Construction industry perhaps has never changed. Sorry if there's anybody here from the construction industry. The 385th Bombardment Group arrived June 1943. They flew over 300 missions from this aerodrome. They lost some 160 Flying Fortress bombers, over 400 men. But what I want to try and do is not look at the base as you can see it today, derelict, crumbling, but hopefully to go back 80 years and enter Great Ashfield as it was from June 43 to June 45, the home of Van's Valiants after their first commanding officer, Colonel Elliot Van Beventer. For this programme, I've broadened the 385th to include the support 424th Air Service Group and smaller organisations also based at Great Ashfield. It was home to around 3,000 personnel. It wasn't always this tidy. You can see little picket fences and gardens, but in the early days they lived in tents on the mud while the airfield was being completed. Now, all the Yanks, and I say Yanks with all due respect to our American cousins who will perhaps be seeing this on YouTube, in World War II, the British invariably called them Yanks, whatever state they came from. To us, we endeared them as the Yanks. Damp weather, freezing conditions, typically British, not like tonight's lovely sunny evening. Now, if you were an airman in the 385th, your space allocation as an officer was 96 square feet. If you were a sergeant, 58 square feet. If you were coming down the ranks, 38 square feet, and then they chopped that down to 32 square feet, because they had to plan all of these buildings. They had to plan how many people would be fitted in there. And this is Thomas Funk in his quarters, complete with pin-ups there. Now, funnily enough, the research continues. I had an email from his family this week. They had never seen this photograph, so I've sent them this picture and they've sent me some more. So the research is always ongoing. The 385th was 4 bombardment squadrons, the 548th, 549th, 550th, 551st, and a headquarters unit. 36 to 48, sometimes more aircraft. Originally, they would be around 36, but as American production moved into higher gear, there were more aircraft coming over, and some of the groups went up to 38, 48, and so on upwards. 400 odd aircrew, supporting personnel over 2,000. Now, the airbase was actually bigger than the village of Great Ashfield, but it was grafted on for the duration. If you look at this, in the distance there is a harvest there. I don't think the harvests today look like that anymore. Farmers here would probably tell us. Beautiful Suffolk countryside, like this evening, very tranquil, but it was war. And the group's role, like some 114 others, was to put bombs onto targets in Nazi Germany. It might seem harsh now, but in 1940 and 40 onwards, the only way this beleaguered island could fight back was through air power, until D-Day, of course. So we're going to do a little typical mission. We're going to take the bombs from the bomb dump at Great Ashfield, which I think is now a slurry pit, I'm told. It's disappeared, it's still there somewhere. Now, bombs overall. Bomb stores were adjacent to the airfield, and if you look at the map, you didn't want the bomb store too close in case it exploded. That happened at Metfield with devastating consequences. Narrow concrete roads between the bomb bays in case the bombs detonated. You had 2,000 to 3,000 tons of bombs at Great Ashfield as typical storage. Incendiaries and Nissen huts nearby. And the one thing I will point out, that none of this could have happened without the courage of the Merchant Navy, the Royal Navy, and the seamen that shipped everything over under Operation Bolero, the movement to Europe. Fuel installation, 12,000 gallon tanks. Ultimately, some of the bases went up to 216,000 tanks. You could use all of that on one single combat mission. So this war is about logistics. While the airmen slept, or at least tried to, at Great Ashfield, the bombs would be trolleyed out in the wee small hours to B-17s, and men like Billy here would load them up. Each flying fortress, a crew of 10, 2,700 odd gallons of gasoline, and they could use 2.5 million gallons of gasoline on one 1,000 bomber raid. And the Americans flew 20 1,000 bomber raids in March of 1945. So think of the figures. Oxygen, ammunition. A dangerous cocktail. 2 aircraft exploded on the base at Great Ashfield during its history. And when we do the tour around the base in the summertime, I point out where the aircraft were. The ground crew would be trying to guess the target. How many bombs, how much fuel? Obviously, more bombs, less fuel, closer target. Less bombs, more fuel, further target. The aircrew would be briefed, breakfast. 3 o'clock in the morning they would be woken up. This is a 2,000-pound bomb being loaded, and look, that is the catwalk that you would have to walk along to get from the back to the front of the aircraft, or vice versa. And if you had a bomb hang up, sometimes you would have to go and dislodge it, kick the thing out. No parachute, wind chill, minus 40 degrees. These guys were very brave men. Very anxious moments. Many of us might admit to going on holiday, when you sit there in the comfort of your jet, how many of you do sense a little bit of nervousness when those throttles go forward and you know you're committed to take off? Well, you're not carrying bombs and gasoline to the same extent, and oxygen. 120 miles an hour, the B-17 from Great Ashfield here gets airborne. A long, slow climb to assembly. If the conditions were like today, visual, you could assemble over the base. But often in the British Isles, you did not have visual conditions. So you would follow these procedures, and this shows the assembly areas for the many bomb groups. Great Ashfield would disappear down towards Colchester to do their assembly. It also indicates the three big airborne armies in East Anglia. The 1st Air Division to the west, the 2nd Air Division up in Norfolk, and the 3rd Air Division, including Great Ashfield, down in the Ipswich area. This shows what it would be like. You take off from your aerodrome, a 5-minute leg going up towards the cloud base. You're listening on the radio for a buncher signal. You get over the buncher signal, you turn, you climb, you go into the overcast. And one veteran said to me, it was like being in a dark room, a blacked out room, and somebody is swinging a baseball bat. That's how it felt. And sometimes you would get the thump as you went very close to another fortress. You couldn't see it. And then hopefully you would break out into the clear. And the lead aircraft, there would be an element of 3 bombers, which would build up into a squadron, which would build up into a group. Round and round and round they would go, climbing higher and higher before they set off for their target. They flew in boxes, boxes like this. These boxes were designed so that the guns would uncover to give maximum protection to the bomber formation from incoming fighters. And this is the box concept. You can see here the distance. 1,560 feet side to side. You've got 600 feet deep. Dozens upon dozens of aircraft flying towards the target, and including our group, the 385th. They changed it. The dynamics of war meant that in the early days, fighters were the main threat to the men of the 385th. But as the war progressed, flak became the main enemy, so they altered formations to suit. And it would be a long, cold haul to the target. The contrails would be a giveaway. The Germans would have them on radar anyway. And this is Dragon Lady from the 385th here at the front. She survived until the 13th of February 44, when flak forced Lieutenant Heron to ditch. 3 of his crewmen died. Ed continued until he was killed in action on October the 6th, 1944, one of the 385th's most disastrous missions. And flak, it was ugly, it was scary. Against fighters, the men of the 385th used to say to me, you felt you could hit back, you could shoot, but against flak, you had to ride it through. You tried to make yourself as small as you possibly could. You would hide up as much as you could behind the instrument panel as you saw 109s or 190s boring straight in at you. And in this, over 30 shells are bracketing these 385th aircraft. And each shell exploded had a lethal radius of 30 feet of shrapnel that could rip flesh or aircraft to pieces. Little Audrey from Great Ashfield, and you can see Flax chewing her tail. She did over 100 missions, 18 engine changes, got home with her tail intact in 1945, and then was scrapped. Mission after mission. This is Mersburg, 29th of July 1944, mission 160. These trails here are smoke markers. They would drop markers, what you would be doing as the pilot. You would watch for the lights coming from the lead aircraft. There would be a light would come on, and they would release smoke markers, and then they would try and release their bombs simultaneously to get a closer concentration on the target. War's end, bombing techniques had changed. H-2X, I mentioned there, is a British designed radar developed by the Americans. That meant they could bomb through 10/10 cloud. The weather had to be defeated, and that was one of the pieces of technology that helped do that. And this one, as I've said, a sight to freeze the heart. At interrogation, they'd say, how many shoots? How many did you see? Sometimes they were counted. Sometimes in fierce combat, an aircraft would disappear. You didn't see it go down. This is Berlin in March 1944. This is a Pathfinder aircraft on which the 385th Doc Dentoni went down. He was a lead bombardier on the Marienburg mission, which Hap Arnold, the big boss of the 8th Air Force, said was the finest piece of precision bombing. Credit to the 385th. But there were casualties, of course. 1943, Cambridge University dedicated and donated some land where the fallen might rest. 3,812 of them, including many from Great Ashfield, are still there, with 5,000 more names on the wall of the missing. So, for our typical mission, journey home, leaving the enemy coast, the North Sea, and then the welcome coast of England down below. Follow the Iron Beam, possibly, looking for a railway track, coming in from, say, Great Yarmouth, pointing straight at Great Ashfield, the Iron Beam home. A lovely image of a 385th B-17. I like to think this one, she's safely home, back over England, mission accomplished, crew safe. And this is a classic picture. 80 years or so ago, an evening like this, the sky over Great Ashfield would have been shaking with the return of B-17s. Even now, me being me, up on that airfield, listen, go up there, stand on that runway, and you might hear some echoes. Just think about it the next time you're walking up there. Sweating them in was the parlance. All around the field, the personnel, the ground crews would watch, they would wait, they would count the aircraft in, and so did many of the villagers. They knew how many of the aircraft went out from their aerodrome, and they would count them back in. A return ticket, B-17 coming in on final approach. A return ticket this time. Wounded aboard, red flares going up, coming in sometimes with an engine feathered. The engine is dead, the propeller is turned into the slipstream, feathered. Meat wagons, as they rather gruesomely called them, wait as the fortress comes in. And back in the days when we used to have the veterans over, I spoke to one of the B-17 crew and he said, oh yes, he remembered coming in firing red flares, and apparently one of the flares landed on a thatched cottage in the village and set the roof on fire, and the villager was actually there, so the two met, and they seemed quite happy about it after all that time. And the stretcher bearers moving in. That scene, again, many times at Great Ashfield. And sometimes, yes, hard to imagine if you stand on what's left of the runway. and the strain on the faces of these men. Too many pictures that I have in the collection don't say who or when, and I just hope that he survived. Fred Eilenberg, one of the veterans I met, he wrote a book about it, and he joined what they called the Lucky Bastard Club in 1944. And this shows his B-17 Genie Jinriki II doing what they called a buzz job, right low over to celebrate doing his missions. He's completed it. Now, what I want to do is just really take a sort of photo album approach and trot through some more of the 385th history. Interrogation then. Relief. You're home. Shot whiskey for some. Questions. How many fighters? Where? Lieutenant Karl Dworski there in the front. 4th of October 43, he dragged a battered Flying Fortress home. The crew bailed out, he pointed it seawards and jumped. 6 weeks later, his B-17, man of war, mid-air collision, he was killed in action. A tour. How many missions to complete a tour? 25 when you first arrived, and very unlikely you would achieve it. Something around 64 out of every 100 would not make completion of their first tour in those very early days. But as the numbers of aircraft grew, as the Allies began slowly to win the war, they increased the number of missions. You had to do 30, and then 35. And this is Rural Wyker's crew with some shuttle souvenirs. More on the shuttle later. Rule's in the middle at the front. He did 2 tours of combat. He chanced his luck. He volunteered for a second tour after completing his first. And after World War II, he was involved in pulling the reunion group together in the 1960s. His B-17, Mary Pat, named after his wife, waiting for him at home. He got home, they had a good life, family, etc. But the early days at Great Ashfield, this photograph, 20th of August 1943, Colonel Vann, there he is, accepting the deeds of the base from Squadron Leader King. Quite literally, King would hand over the keys. But there weren't many airmen about at that time. They were actually in much sunnier climes. August 1943, the 17th, infamous in 8th Air Force history, the shuttle mission. A 2-pronged attack was planned. Regensburg aircraft plants and Schweinfurt ball bearing plants. But the UK weather ruined the plans. Instead of having 2 forces going out more or less simultaneously and dividing the enemy reaction, the weather prevented one from going off, so when they took off, their plans had been ruined, and both forces were attacked. There was no fighter escort beyond the range of maximum endurance that the fighters had. They lost 60 bombers, 600 men did not come back to England that day. And this image was taken of Regensburg from the B-17 Raunchy Wolf of the 385th. Over the Alps, across the Med, into the desert. Tired, exhausted, low on fuel. The 385th, as I've said, they paid for their ticket into history. Flak took out the Summers crew. Fighters cut Les Reichardt's sack time to pieces. Keeley ditched pregnant Portia in the Med. Frank Walls took this one, Shag Bunny. He brought her back after a bit of bartering for souvenirs from the Arab population. Ferdinand, he really means business there. As I've said, personally, I'd rather have a 50 caliber than throwing knives at the enemy. Ferdinand was on Keeley's crew. They had ditched in the Med. They came home with their souvenirs. 6 weeks later, they were killed in action after a mid-air collision with the Anello crew. one survivor from each aircraft. They were on their 11th mission. It shows how bad the odds were. Around September 43, 3 of the squadron COs, Bill Tesler, Seth Richard, Arch Benner. The aircraft is the fickle finger of which lasted through the war. Some did, some didn't. And I'm glad John Pettinger and crew did. John is kneeling there with his crew. The aircraft was called the Vibrant Virgin. Perhaps not necessarily PC today, but that's what it was called. Why it was called the Vibrant Virgin, I did ask him, and he just went, that's one bit of history you're not going to know. So I never did find out. It was lost on the 8th of October 43 with the Jensen crew, POWs. 2 days later, John and his crew joined them on the Munster mission. He was shot down, became a POW. Now, the psychologist George R. Clare reckoned around 55% of nose art was the female form. 25% of these were nude. Most of the remainder partly clothed. And one crew coming overseas went through what they call POM inspection, processing overseas movement. And they had a young lady on their aircraft painted on there, completely naked. And the POM inspector said, you can't go overseas like that. You have to put some clothes on her. So they painted a swimming costume onto her in watercolour. But more importantly, it aided morale. It provided bonding. Aircraft weren't always named by the airmen, they were sometimes named by the ground crew. This one, no nose art yet, a typical crew. And in the middle there is a little spangle, Roger. Now Roger introduced himself, he was picked up in the States, and he introduced himself to John Zavishow there by jumping up on his cot and peeing on him. Well, I mean, what does a puppy do? But pets again were that support for morale. The aircraft, an inventory number 425914, named Sack Time. And the Reichardt crew intended to bring Roger overseas. Now the problem they had is, as they set out to leaving America, they found they were hitting bad weather. So Roger was on board and they would have to climb upwards of 20,000 feet. And there was no oxygen for Roger. So they declared a malfunction and turned back and landed, didn't say they were trying to save their dog, and waited until the weather got better, and Roger came happily overseas, landed at Great Ashfield, and was greeted very warmly by Van Deventer. Artwork, primarily on the nose, but you can see there's Roger on the side there. He adorned Sack Time's fuselage. When the crew didn't come home, he stood on the hardstand waiting and waiting until he was picked up by somebody else that knew him, and eventually he was smuggled back to America on the Queen Mary in a duffel bag by one of the other veterans. Not all one-sided combat. The Munster mission, 10th of October, John Ritchie's crew. This one, Ohio Air Force, came home claiming, with all those swastikas there, 12 enemy aircraft. Now, historians now know that overclaiming was done by all sides, the RAF, the Germans and the Americans. But no doubt about it, the 8th Air Force took a heavy toll of enemy aircraft. And many Luftwaffe pilots spoke about how scary it was to attack a B-17 or a Liberator formation. The first crew at Great Ashfield completed their tour November 43. Raunchy Wolf, 25 missions. And Bartholomew there was particularly lucky because over Regensburg, the door fell off his ball turret and he fell out of the aircraft. Luckily, his foot caught up in the controls and he was hanging upside down at 20,000 feet over the target. The other crew were too busy to help him, and eventually he managed to get, with his foot trapped in the range pedal, pull himself into the aircraft and completed his 25. Luck could be with you, or it might not. But particularly good reason. Thanksgiving Day, this is the troops celebrating in Mess Hall number 1 at Great Ashfield. There were 3 mess halls on the base, all long since gone. These blokes, a little bit more formal. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis. This is the Air Service Group. He was in charge of the ground echelons there doing the support work. More on that later. But tragedy is never far away. 30th November, Liberty Bell, lost during assembly. A flare exploded inside, because to fire a flare in a B-17, you cracked open the pistol and you put a flare in. You were supposed to take the pistol out and put the flare in that way. Sometimes they didn't. In this case, the flare was dropped. Bob Smith, the pilot in the cockpit there, heard a bang, turned, and the flare actually hit him right between the eyes. It bounced off, ricocheted around, and then set the top turret area ablaze. Nate Ungar, the navigator, he had his own nose art, strictly from Ungar, on the starboard side. Nate and the bombardier Charles Stevens each grabbed their chutes. They jumped out, but each had grabbed the other's chute, and the harnesses were incompatible. Both of them plummeted to their deaths. Nate is still buried at Madingley. Liberty Bell spread across the Essex countryside. The co-pilot, Jim McKee, top turret gunner, also died. Bob Smith, terrible injuries, survived, went home, family, happy life. He was one of the veterans that came home here in tours years ago. But to ease the strain, this is Forrest Poor with the bag, Bill Nichols with the pipe, waiting at Elmswell Station, there with Jim Lewis. All 3 of them are heading into London for both the high and the low life, as some of them later admitted. That was where they went, London. Winter 43-44, vicious combat. The Luftwaffe was not yet defeated. The flak, completely unforgiving. The 385th battled on. This is Lieutenant Bostic coming back from the Bremen raid. He took Lady Liz here into Beccles Aerodrome, very badly shot up. To the credit of the ground personnel, she was resurrected, flew again as Lady Susie II, and went home as Dixie Flyer in April of 1944. It wasn't always serious. This is Arthur Woodall and Bill Nichols clowning about, showing how every well-dressed officer should look. Arthur is wearing Bill's garrison cap. He was killed in action on a B-17 called Mary Ellen that crashed at Rickinghall, not that far away from us. Bill survived, a friend for many years, and one of the stalwarts of the reunions. And the ground crews, more on them later, they worked hard. But in speaking to a lot of them, they were very proud of the role. They cared for the men and the aircraft as much as they possibly could. Sometimes becoming too close to a crew could hurt if that crew did not come home. This one, the 11th of December 43, slow Joe. Emden, 100 enemy aircraft. Jensen and 6 of his crew were killed when this aircraft broke up under ferocious attack. And one thing about the 385th, tremendous heart and spirit. Sep Richards there with Sergeant Joe McLavish. He organised children's Christmas parties. That was the thing about many of the Americans on the bases. Around the period before Christmas, in Great Ashfield, on the aerodrome, they would be raising money for a children's party or talking to the mechanics and engineers about making toys for local children. And why not? Many of the men working on that base had families at home. If you were ground crew, you were here for the duration, and you would miss your children. You may not have seen them for months, you may not see them for a couple of years. The 548th Squadron adopted orphans and raised funds for their future education. And you can imagine the kids, look at the size of that chocolate cake for wartime Britain. Christmas 43 and the crackers the 385th took to Germany. Here is Chet Doran and crew, a PR picture on the 22nd of December. The aircraft, Mr. Smith, clocked over 80 missions. They survived, the aircraft got hit and went down with the Montgomery crew. And this picture is dated January the 15th, 1944. Shows Sid Colthorpe, the navigator on Mr. Smith. In the 1990s, elderly and frail, he came back and he said to us, I remember him talking to me, he wanted to make one last pilgrimage to Great Ashfield. And it was his last pilgrimage. He died not many weeks later after he returned home. But he paid homage to his old base, to its memories, and to its ghosts. Sometimes aircraft in trouble, homeward bound, they would be chucking the guns out, anything that they could do to shed weight. Stardust here, February 44, limped into RAF Detling. The brakes were shot out, Sweden couldn't stop, and he piled into a pillbox. Toggles, Fred Berlinger lost a leg in that accident. Later the same month, a critical month, the RAF and the US Army Air Force combined in a concerted round-the-clock attack on German airfields. The Big Week it was called, Operation Argument. This is the 385th Junior over Diepholz Aircraft Depot on the 21st of February 1944. That day saw Jack Curtis, co-pilot, and Joe Hutchison flying their 25th mission, their last one. They would be home. Along from the photo lab went this young man, 19-year-old boat trimming photographer. It would be good for morale when crews completed their 25th mission. Hutch had seen his crew through 25 of the roughest missions in late 43. The shuttle mission, and this, after they had force landed in the desert, is the crew. Hutch and his crew there. All the men in bold here were killed in action at Reedham on that 25th mission. But the mission was accomplished. They bombed the hell out of Diepholz, journey home. Approaching Great Yarmouth, they loosened the formation into a Vic and descended into cloud. On his 13th mission, Lieutenant Pease, Warren Pease, disappeared from the formation during letdown and then emerged in a steep dive and pulled up in front of Hutch's aircraft. And triumph turned into tragedy. Two B-17s collided. They were minutes from landing, and the aircraft alongside them had looked, they'd seen Hutch had lit a big cigar. They'd begun to celebrate, but there were no survivors from the 21 men involved in the collision. The aircraft plummeted into Reedham Marshes in Norfolk. 21 men died in as many seconds. And there were tears on the base at Great Ashfield because they felt Hutch was going to make it. He would be lucky. He didn't. And I have to be grateful to the community at Reedham for helping pull this montage together of all the 21 men involved. There was very little recognisable of either bomber. This is the tail section with the square G for Great Ashfield. And this is the Pease aircraft. Now this site was the subject of the 1999 Time Team TV programme, which some of you may have seen, and I think you can now see it on YouTube. 1964, I found the wreckage of the aircraft, but I didn't know who it was. Nobody could tell me, so I started a long investigative journey. Decades. And I had a special connection with this crew, these crews, which took me into my special connection with Great Ashfield. Now, as a result of the communities in Great Ashfield, in Reedham, Time Team, and my friends involved in aviation archaeology, there is a memorial dedicated to the crews at Reedham. And on the 80th anniversary, this past February, people from Reedham and Great Ashfield paid tribute to the young men, so they are no longer forgotten. I do a separate talk, Reedham Remembers, which is the story of the search and recovery. Items are in various museums, UK and USA. This parachute is displayed at the US Air Force Museum. Over 300,000 people annually visit that, and hopefully it adds and reminds them of the sacrifice on their behalf. Also, there is a 385th Museum at Pearl in Luxembourg. I'm trying to put as much into this as I can, so you can, if you are interested, follow through later. The war rolled on, and I've been rolling on too. I've been keeping an eye on the watch, so we're about 45 minutes in. Big B, March of 1944. The 8th hit Berlin for the first time, then 5 times that month. Colonel Vance here is relaxing the mission on the 9th of March, and Big B scared the pants out of many of them simply because of the name and the length of time that it would take to get to the target. Now, I think he's got a cup of tea, or probably coffee actually, so I think you deserve either, well, not that, but something from the bar back there, and we'll kick off in 20 odd minutes or so's time. Thank you. First half, I'll take questions.